Regardless of which side of the fence you're on, red or green, most of us can agree that Nvidia was a bit misleading when it came to their advertised 4GB of VRAM on their GTX 970s. For those of you who aren't familiar with this issue, Nvidia's standard for VRAM supply has been about 3GB up until the GTX 780, but with the release of the 970 and the 980, an extra VRAM chip has been added to the PCB to communicate with the new Maximal Architecture GPU to add an extra gigabyte of VRAM. So now we have 4 gigs instead of 3 gigs, and it's advertised as such on both the GTX 970 and the GTX 980. But while the GTX 980 can access its full 4GB of VRAM at its full bus frequency, the GTX 970 has a bit of a problem past 3.5 gigabytes. Up to 3.5 gigabytes, the GTX 970 behaves identically to the GTX 980, but it's that final 0.5 gigabytes of VRAM that is the GTX 970's Achilles heel. But why? Because that final half a gig of VRAM is actually severely underclocked in terms of how fast it communicates with the GPU. This can pose a problem for gamers who, like to throw a bunch of dense texture packs into their games or turn up distance scaling to the max setting possible. These kinds of additional VRAM requirements can pose mighty big problems for the GTX 970. So what I've got in this rig behind me is a Gigabyte WindForce GTX 970 G1 Gaming Edition graphics card. We're going to throw a few games at it, but I expect in particular GTA 5 to reveal some pretty obvious results. So we're going to be able to see whether or not passing 3.5 gigabytes of memory allocation poses a problem for the GTX 970 and for you who are utilizing the GTX 970 currently. So let's go ahead and investigate. Let's see what we end up with. I wanted to try a few games other than GTA 5 first. I honestly didn't think City Skylines or Dirt Rally would even utilize more than about 3 gigabytes of VRAM, and I was right. With every single setting in both games completely maxed out, we didn't even pass 3.2 gigabytes of memory usage. We also never dipped below 30 FPS in either game, which was quite nice. So on to GTA 5 then. My first step was to turn settings up just enough to rub against the 3.5 gig boundary. This test would be our control. I drove a few blocks through the city and then made my way into the mountains, where I expected the grass being on ultra to drop our frame rate by a significant amount. I was averaging about 40 FPS in the city and about 25 FPS in the grass, which seemed about right. Next, I pushed the memory usage just above 3.5 gigabytes and ran through the same course. But I didn't notice any frame rate dips apart from journeying through the grass once again. Now on my third run, next, I maxed out every possible setting. Again, no noticeable frame drops or stuttering in 1080p. The next trial consisted of lowering a few advanced graphic settings and pushing the frame scale up to 5/4, essentially increasing our in-game resolution by 25%. This pushed us a solid 200 megabytes above the 3.5 gig threshold, but no, still nothing. Our overall frame rate had definitely been sliced, but nothing out of the ordinary ended up slashing our FPS. Until rain. That's right, it began raining in the game, and then suddenly stuttering here, stuttering there. It was fairly consistent throughout, and could definitely become a nuisance if its presence was prolonged. What's likely going on here is that the rain is requiring the graphics card to completely remap texture units. Since the transition is nowhere near as slow as the fade from day to night, the memory bus is consistently being squeezed for every ounce of data. Only the final half gig of memory is taking much longer to send data to the GPU. Now, because it's only 5% of the total memory bandwidth being restrained, the stuttering isn't prolonged, but when it strikes with a vengeance. A solid couple seconds of gameplay is completely lost in the process, which could be disastrous, especially in first-person shooters or RPGs. So I guess we should summarize it like this. If you plan on playing in 1080p only with your GTX 970 to the point where you can max out pretty much any setting that you wish, you're going to be just fine in almost any circumstance. 1440p is a slightly different story, only slightly, and here's why. While yes, you will be using more memory in 1440p because you're going to be needing to store larger chunks of data because you're going to be pushing more pixels to a screen, you will have to cut back on some things such as anti-aliasing, ambient occlusion maybe. Some of those things you'll have to scale back in order to keep those appropriate frame rates around 30 to 60 FPS in most AAA titles. So in a sense, you'll be adding some memory requirements, but you'll be subtracting some as well by cutting back on those additional settings. 2160p, totally different beast, but I don't recommend purchasing a GTX 970 for the purpose of playing AAA titles in 4K. And I don't have a 4K monitor, so we're not going to be able to test that truly anyway. But think about it, you're going to be increasing your pixel density, right, playing in 4K, but you're going to have to cut back on things like texture packs and rendering distances and anti-aliasing. All of that you'll be able to notice much more when playing in 4K, so it kind of counteracts itself. It's kind of oxymoronic, actually. So I wouldn't purchase this for 4K gaming. You might be okay with it, but I'm not, and that's why I'm not going to test them in this video, test that resolution. But in 1080p and 1440p, this card handles quite a bit of memory usage very well. Even when it passes 3.5 gigabytes, the card's fairly smart. It knows what memory data needs to be sent to the GPU right away and what can wait. And the stuff that can wait is typically allocated in that slower half a gig portion of memory, and that's that. That's why the GTX 970 doesn't suffer as much as it appears to suffer in all of these tech vlogs and websites that say that this is such a big issue. So with that, you all know the routine. Let me know what you think about the GTX 970 and whether or not you should consider it over the R9 390, which is generally a better performer in most games and does come with twice as much VRAM. That's right, 8 gigabytes of VRAM versus 4 or 3.5 and 0.5 of slow VRAM, depending on how you look at it. If you own a GTX 970, let me know in the comments below and tell me what you personally think about your card. I'm very interested to hear what you have to say. Be sure to give the video a thumbs up if you thought the video was great, and give it a thumbs down if you think that we need to improve somewhere. Apart from that, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. We'll be posting some pretty cool benchmarks in regards to our Pentium G4400 and a GTX 970 pairing. How well will a pretty cheap CPU do with a very powerful GPU? Find out in our next video. This is Science Studio. Thanks for learning with us.